Scandinavia, the jewel in the crown of Europe. Unless you're watching from there, and according to my viewer demographics, a lot of you are, the 5 Scandinavian countries are richer, more beautiful, and happier than yours is. The 3 countries of the main Scandinavian peninsula all have in the past maintained a policy of military neutrality. Let's start with Norway. At the outbreak of World War II, Norway wasn't the wealthy country it is today. They were unable to defend themselves from German occupation. However, that didn't stop them giving the Germans a bloody nose. When the Kriegsmarine had the genius idea of sailing their brand new, prized heavy cruiser down a fjord and into Oslo in the middle of the night, practically unsupported, the Norwegians absolutely shredded it at practically point-blank range with Victorian-era naval guns and torpedoes. If Norway gave Germany a bloody nose, Finland put the Soviet Union in a coma and on life support. Finland had a policy of armed neutrality. This meant a highly trained and prepared population. So, when Stalin had the even more genius idea of invading, the Soviets lost 150,000 men. Soviet aircraft losses outnumbered Finnish losses about 30-1. Tank losses 100-1. 100-1. In the end, the Soviets won. Won is in enormous air quotes there. Finland lost some land and maintained its sovereignty. The most Pyrrhic victory I'm aware of in modern warfare. And then there's Sweden. Totalförsvaret. Total defence concept. Every able-bodied citizen of Sweden stands ready to repel anyone stupid enough to try and screw around with their borders. And those borders are a fortress. Mountains to the north, thousands of square kilometres of forest in the centre, and a coastline dotted with islands to the south. And it comes with its own homegrown arms industry. Submarines, tanks, anti-ship missiles, very effective anti-tank missiles, howitzers, you name it, the Swedes build it. But the cherry on top? Fighter jets. Now the Swedes fly the Gripen, but back in the late 1960s, this little country of just 10 million people built the most advanced fighter in Europe. The Viggen. Surely, no nation would be stupid enough to mess around with Sweden's borders. Would they? This is the #1 most requested topic for this channel, and for good reason. The CK37 computer installed in the Viggen was years ahead of its time. Many of you will have arrived here after viewing my video on the F-14 Central Air Data Computer. This video may be considered a kind of spiritual successor to that one, but I want to emphasise right from the start, the CK37 in the Viggen was a completely different beast to the computer in the F-14, both in terms of functionality and in construction. Truth is, I always felt a bit of a fraud making a video about the F-14, since it's an aircraft I know very little about. I feel the same here, but for different reasons. I'm pretty familiar with the Viggen, but I didn't know that much about its computer until I started the research for this video. And that research has only been possible thanks to Alexander Blix, who provided me with an absolute goldmine of original declassified documentation for the Viggen. I'd also like to give thanks to this user from my Patreon, whose name I'm not sure how to pronounce, for providing translation services, and also for providing some photos of a Viggen at a museum. I'll flash these up every now and then throughout the video. That documentation is, of course, all in Swedish. I've therefore used some machine learning tools for translation, but Alexander and a few others have also been instrumental in providing translation for me. On the subject of language, I normally take a good shot at pronunciations. However, when I try to put on a Swedish accent to say Viggen, it just sounds like I'm from Wales, so I'll stop trying that. In my experience, Swedish people are very nice, so I doubt I'll make anyone too angry by messing up pronunciations. As for the Viggen itself, we'll be discussing one specific variant, the AJ37. This first flew in 1967 and entered service in 1971. The AJ37 was the first variant to enter service, and it was the fighter-bomber variant. The CK37 computer was present in all AJ37 Viggens and remained in operation with upgrades until 2001. The computer I'll be discussing in this video is the original production variant of the CK37, unless I specify otherwise. There were 3 prototype versions, and the computer was upgraded with peripherals throughout its life, so it can get a little confusing going through the source material sometimes. On that subject, the AJ37 is not to be confused with the later Interceptor variant, the JA37, which entered service in 1979. This also contained a highly advanced computer, but that computer was manufactured in the US. In fact, the JA37's computer was a direct development of the F-14's computer. But that is a different discussion. Let's find out why the Swedes were so keen to be the first to develop the first ever fighter with a compact digital central computer. To understand the need for such a complex computer, we need to appreciate Sweden's use case for fighter jets in the first place. Most nations build or buy aircraft for a wide variety of roles or missions. Take the Eurofighter, for example. It's designated as a multi-role fighter. It can be used for ground strike, air superiority, electronics warfare, reconnaissance, SEAD, the list goes on. And it's designed to fulfill those roles practically anywhere on Earth. Sweden's Air Force, on the other hand, is designed to operate in one place, Sweden. And the AJ-37 was designed solely as a ground strike aircraft to be used for one role, repelling an enemy invasion. There were of course some highly specific requirements to allow it to fulfill this narrow role. Probably most famously was the requirement to take off and land in just 450 metres. This allowed it to land on specially designated stretches of public highway, and subsequently be dispersed around Sweden's vast forests, hidden from prying eyes. This limited application presented an opportunity. The AJ-37 was designed as the replacement for the Lansen, which entered service in the mid-1950s. The Lansen was of course an excellent aircraft and was only retired in 1997. But to keep up with Western and Soviet contemporaries, the Viggen would need to be much faster than the Lansen, which could barely manage supersonic flight. Now, the Swedes had also developed and introduced into service another absolutely revolutionary aircraft, the Draken. I'm told this is a bit of a fan favourite amongst aircraft enthusiasts, as it looked really weird. But much like the Viggen, when it entered service, it was one of the best fighters on Earth. The Draken, though, was an aerial interceptor, designed to be scrambled and to interdict enemy aircraft in flight. A ground strike aircraft placed more requirements on the crew, navigation and weapon system management being the two most pressing. So, the Lansen was a 2-seater aircraft, a pilot and a navigator. The Draken just needed a pilot. Some of its radar and flight data needs were handled with analog computation devices, but, well, analog computers are a bit of a build, maintenance and capability nightmare. By the way, we'll revisit analog flight computers in a big way in my next video. So, it seems there were 2 options. A fast strike aircraft with 2 engines that would be expensive but meet the need for a supersonic fighter, or a slow one with just 1 engine, cheap, but Sweden already had one of those. How about an innovative third option? Replacing that second crew member with a digital computer. Before we get into how the CK37 was developed, I think it's appropriate to take a couple of minutes to put it into context alongside 2 other early digital flight computers. Between the mid-1950s and the mid-1960s, almost every general-purpose computer sold to the general public used discrete components. That is, individual transistors, diodes and resistors used to build logic gates. And those logic gates were combined to form logic and control units, and those were combined to form a processor. The CK37 was, I believe, the first computer to be constructed using publicly available integrated circuits. That is, single chip packages which combined multiple transistors in a small and convenient package. IC-based computers did exist prior, in the form of ballistic missile guidance computers, but they may have only beat the CK37 by a matter of months. The first prototype was delivered sometime in the middle of 1963, which also beat the IBM 360, which is also often quoted as the first IC-based computer. And the second prototype of the CK37 first flew in 1965 in a SAAB Lansen. That is an event believed to be the first ever flight of an IC-based avionics computer. The first production computer was delivered in April 1970, and of course the Viggen as a whole went fully operational in June 1971. And that brings us to our first comparison. The most famous integrated circuit-based computer of all time, and favourite topic of this channel, the Apollo guidance computer. And before we go any further, let's be clear, these comparisons are for historical context. Please don't start arguing which computer was, quote, best, unquote, in the comments. They were completely different machines for completely different purposes. It's tricky putting a first date on the AGC. It was no doubt more advanced than the CK37, but not by as much as I initially thought. It arrives later in the timeline. The development of the software for the AGC was a nightmare and resulted in a short gap between the first prototype demonstration and the first flight. The Block 1 version of the AGC was first placed in a spacecraft in September 1965, but it was non-functional. The first version of the software was only delivered in January 1966. It first flew in August 1966 on a suborbital Saturn 1B flight. It's really fuzzy to try and define a production version of the AGC, as it was really an experimental system throughout. The Block 2 was the final hardware version, and that first flew on the first crewed flight, Apollo 7, in October 1968. But the final version of the AGC, complete with lunar landing software, was of course first flown on Apollo 11 in July 1969. An epilogue to all of this is the AGC digital fly-by-wire, first flown in May 1972. I made an entire video about that. Now, imagine combining all of the ICs that make up the CK37, or indeed the AGC, into a single chip, or at the very least a small handful of chips. That'd give us what we now call a microprocessor. And that is what the MP944, which formed the processor of the F-14's Central Air Data Computer, was. I suppose you could say it represented the next generation of flight computers after the Viggen. The MP944 had a development cycle that is best described as heroic. Just 2 years from conception to first delivery. The first operational unit was delivered in June 1970, and a working prototype probably existed sometime around April of 1970. The F-14, and by extension its computer, first flew in December 1970 and entered operational service in September 1974. One other flight computer I should quickly mention before we move on is the one that was in the F-106. That flew in the late 1950s and was probably the first digital flight computer. It was remarkably advanced for its time, but it was an entirely different beast to the CK37. It consisted of vacuum tubes. So while the CK37 was the first integrated circuit-based flight computer, it wasn't quite the first digital flight computer outright. Now let's discuss capability. The two broad aspects I'd like you to have in the back of your mind are scope and authority. What I'm calling scope is the range of tasks required to be performed by the computer. Authority is how much control the computer was given and the extent of the consequences if it failed. In its role as a flight computer, and compared to the two others I just mentioned, I'd say the CK37 was a relatively high scope but low authority machine. Let's look in detail at what it actually did. There were two broad families of tasks: navigation and fire control. I'll look at some of the individual programs that made up these families in the software chapter later, but for now, let's just cover what data was fed into the CK37 and what it was able to provide to the pilot. The first navigation function was waypoint navigation. The coordinates of waypoints were saved in memory, and the pilot was able to enter additional waypoints via the data console, which was a small numeric keypad with a 6-figure display near his or her right hand. To resolve the current position and velocity vector of the aircraft, the computer had a range of inputs available. The first was the inertial navigation system. It was not a top-of-the-range system. We've spoke a lot about those in the past, and those are extremely expensive. But over short periods of time, the gyro-stabilized accelerometers and rotational encoders on the gyros themselves were sufficient to determine velocity and distance travelled. These were complemented by a Doppler velocity measuring device to improve accuracy to a level sufficient for navigation. Long-term viewers of this channel may remember the deep submersible Alvin uses a similar approach of complementing inertial measurement with Doppler velocity for navigation. Over longer time periods, the pilot could perform a manual position fix by entering their current known position either from radio distance measuring equipment or visually. If using radio measuring equipment, this would be entered via a single button push. The radio navigation receiver and decoder was directly available to the computer as an input. In theory, radio navaids were always available because remember, the Viggen was only intended to operate in Swedish airspace. The position fixes disciplined the dead reckoning performed by the computer, which would drift over time. Landing navigation was also performed by the computer. For a predetermined airfield, the computer would provide display information to the pilot to guide them onto the necessary path for a standard approach. For sparse airfields, the navigation subsystem would use the determined position of the aircraft to calculate the approach path. For airfield equipped with an instrument landing system, the computer would switch over automatically to use the ILS data supplied to guide the pilot to a landing. A conceptually simple but extremely useful function provided by the computer was fuel and time management. There is a hidden minor theme in almost all of my videos to date: fuel. From flying a single-seat aircraft to putting a man on the moon, one of, if not the limiting factor, is fuel. And anyone who's flown an aircraft themselves will know how mentally taxing it is already, without having to remember to do your fuel and diversion calculations every 10 minutes. Even more taxing is time to target calculation. Again, anyone who's flown navigation exercises will be more than aware of this. And for a ground strike aircraft like the AJ-37, precise time over target is a must. The CK37 took care of both of these calculations. The pilot would program in the mission parameters, timing, and fuel on board, and the computer would continually display fuel required along with fuel available. For timings, it would display predicted time at target and even give throttle settings to arrive at the desired time. I can't stress enough how helpful offloading mental load from the pilot to a computer is for seemingly basic tasks like this. I speak partially from experience, though I haven't flown an aircraft for years now. Before we take a look at the fire control functionality of the CK37, let's take a look at how all this data was displayed to the pilot, because that was also handled by the computer. Relevant data was plotted on a monochrome CRT display, which was then projected onto an inclined glass plane positioned in the pilot's line of sight. I'm of course referring to a heads-up display, or a HUD. The HUD could switch modes for navigation, takeoff, attack, or landing, but the basic elements were as follows. A pole track indicated the desired bearing to the next waypoint, with the actual velocity vector of the aircraft indicated by this marker. The artificial horizon not only gave a visual representation of the roll, but was also positioned vertically to indicate how far above or below the aircraft was in relation to the pre-programmed flight path. Pitch angle was denoted with a moving pitch scale. Markers were provided for height and speed, with the radar altimeter being used to derive the former. The speed marker was used by the pilot for throttle corrections for the time-to-target calculation. As we shall see, the computer also had access to the attack radar, Though this was a largely independent system, the CK37 also overlaid information on the pilot's radar screen, which was a separate heads-down display in the centre of the cockpit. Additional data would be displayed on the HUD when it was put into attack mode, so to complete our review of the CK37's basic functionality, let's briefly discuss the fire control functions. Unguided bombs, guns and rockets all seem ridiculously crude for an advanced jet like the Viggen, but there are 2 points to consider here. Number 1, the Viggen was first designed in the 1960s, that is, more than 60 years ago. Number 2, even today in 2024, fighter aircraft still often come equipped with cannons. They aren't intended as a primary armament, but they are very useful as a show of force. We'll discuss a real-life example towards the end of this video. The fire control function I can find the most information on is that for the guns and rockets. I'll only discuss it briefly here because we'll be discussing a conceptually similar system in a very big way in my next video. I'm keeping the subject of that video secret, but based off my earlier comment, I suspect there's enough info there for people to take a guess at what it'll be on. Feel free to speculate in the comments and try and bait me into revealing it. Anyway, when in attack mode, the pilot could manually track the position of a target by placing the aiming symbol over the target and tracking it. The computer would determine corrections for lead, wind and ballistic drop and provide a marker on the HUD to aim for. To perform these calculations, the range to and relative velocity of the target required determining. The attack radar automatically provided range data to the CK37. Onboard gyroscopes reported the angular rotation of the aircraft, allowing for lead computation. In addition, data from angle of attack, barometric, airspeed and other sensors were also passed on to the CK37 to allow for ballistic calculations. I don't have much information on the unguided bombing program, but I suspect it'd be quite similar, with situational data provided to the computer, which would then provide a target marker for the pilot to release the bomb at. Similarly, the CK37 was tied into the systems for more advanced guided weaponry, such as the RB-04 anti-ship or Maverick air-to-ground missiles. These were comparatively autonomous, but would require some integration with the Viggen's onboard systems. In addition to all of the above, the CK37 continually performed self-checking. While not as comprehensive as the error detection on something like the F-14's computer, it was sufficient to alert the pilot in the case of a computer system failure, and was perfectly sufficient to perform its role as a non-flight critical system. So that's a summary of everything the CK37 did. Against the AGC and the F-14 CADC, I'd describe it as high scope, low authority. In other words, it did a lot, but the consequences for failure wouldn't be too dire. The F-14's computer only performed a narrow range of functions, but it was flight critical, and therefore carried a higher burden of responsibility than the CK37. Though it is probably worth noting the CADC could have performed many, many more functions, but it'd be either brave or foolish to put so much responsibility on such a nascent technology. One reason the Apollo guidance computer is considered so pivotal is it was high scope and high authority. Barring redundancy, of which there was a surprising amount in both Apollo and the digital fly-by-wire experiments, loss of AGC function would likely mean loss of crew and vehicle during many points of flight. Yet it also performed an astonishingly wide range of tasks. But the AGC came after the CK37, and that is one of the many reasons the CK37 deserves its place at the forefront of computing history. Now, before we finish this chapter, I found some nice reference images for the various HUD modes and displays just a couple of days before releasing the video. I don't really have room to include them in this chapter, but if you skip to the timestamp on screen, I'll display them there. The translations aren't perfect, as I just used machine learning translations, but I think they generally make sense. I think the best time to start the story of the CK37 is in 1960. SAAB already had experience in building and experimenting with electronic computers, having formed a dedicated subsidiary, SAAB. Work had already begun on designing the Viggen, and the company were well into investigating the feasibility of replacing the navigator with a digital computer. A crucial step in this decision was the development of the D2, originally called the SANK, which stands for SAAB's Automatica Navigeringskalkylator. I wonder what that is in English. Anyway, let's just call it the D2 going forward. Completed in 1960, the D2 was composed entirely out of discrete components. About 5,000 transistors and 25,000 diodes, resistors, and other individual parts. It weighed 200 kilos, but it did sit on a desk, so there you go, a competitor for the first desktop to go against the D17B that I proposed a few months ago. In this visibly airbrushed photo, it kind of looks like a good version of that stupid Silicon Valley juice machine from a few years ago, doesn't it? Anyway, the D2 was used to run demo sighting and navigation programs, thus demonstrating the feasibility of an airborne computer. To me, this seems to represent the decision point to pursue a single crew aircraft. If a 200-kilogram computer could be built, surely it could be miniaturized in the several years available before the Lanson's required replacement. And that miniaturization was achieved through an absolutely brand new technology, integrated circuits. Why include a single transistor in a package when you can include several on a single silicon die? That's all an integrated circuit is. This technology was independently invented by Fairchild and Texas Instruments over in the US, thanks to a virtually unlimited military budget as it was required for, well, you can watch my last video to learn more about that. In that video, we met Robert Noyce of Fairchild, who was the person responsible for bringing the first practical ICs to market, the Fairchild Micrologic series. Before they were even publicly available, Bjorn Hallberg at SAAB, who incidentally, according to SAAB, became Europe's leading expert on ICs and was the first person in Europe to hold an IC in his hand, sent across a representative to meet with Noyce and the team at Fairchild. Sweden may have been militarily neutral, but they were very much aligned with the West. And the Americans were happy to discuss the technology with them before the general release of the Micrologic series in July of 1961. And no, it probably wasn't because they foresaw the Viggen as potentially protecting their Polaris submarines. That appears to be a bit of a myth concocted after the fact. The major concern with these new components was reliability. Now, the CK37 was not flight critical as such. Unlike something like a fly-by-wire computer, a catastrophic failure wouldn't cause a loss of aircraft. However, it probably would lead to a loss of mission. For this reason, the complexity of adding redundant computers could be avoided. But a reliability for the system as a whole on the order of one failure per several hundred hours of operation was necessary. The CK37 contained approximately 2,700 integrated circuits, in addition to 1,400 discrete transistors and 3,800 resistors. Extensive reliability testing of the components, the circuitry, and computers as a whole was carried out from the first delivery of the ICs in 1961 all the way to the first Viggen flight in 1967. The aggregate failure rate for an individual IC was about 0.006% per 1,000 hours of operation. For a single computer, that would give a failure probability of around 15% per 1,000 hours of operation. Of course, the ICs were far from the only element that could fail. The computer contained 51,000 solder joints. Despite soldering being carried out by a certified technician and every joint being inspected individually under a microscope, 50% of failures during testing of the computer were due to solder joints. This is actually another reason for switching to ICs. 51,000 joints is a lot, but it's less than would be necessary for discrete components. The conclusion of the testing was a predicted mean time between failure for the CK37 of 250 hours under operational conditions, and that was deemed acceptable. With an estimated 150 flight hours per aircraft per year, this equated to a computer failing on average of 1.6 times per year. That sounds like a lot, but honestly, anyone familiar with aircraft maintenance will be familiar with how often components are swapped out, especially in military systems. The final CK37 was delivered in 1978. The final flight of a CK37 equipped Viggen was an AJS variant flown in 2001. Though upgraded with various peripherals, And though individual computers were replaced if they failed, the CK37 was never replaced by a successor over the lifetime of the AJ37. The computers failed at a mean rate of 0.27 per aircraft per year, which was about 1/6 of the predicted failure rate. That's an excellent achievement, and a testament to the skill of a team who were willing to take the leap into integrated circuitry before anyone else in the industry. With the successful deployment of the CK37, a civilian version was also released. Amongst other users, these were apparently used in the Hasselby-Virkert, we'll redub that later, 2 thermal power plant and the Marviken nuclear power plant, which was never actually built. I don't know whether any of these survive to this day, but it is rather encouraging to hear that the CK37 also brought direct benefits to the civilian sector. The CK37 comprised of 4 distinct modules: power supply, memory, logic, and I/O. A complete CK37 consisted of 1 of each of these modules. Each module was a cuboid measuring somewhere around 15 by 30 centimeters. Collectively, the 4 units weighed 70 kilos. Total cost per computer was around $500,000 in 2024 money. All but the power supply were of an unusual physical construction. I've never really seen anything like it. Let's get hold of some of those integrated circuits and build up a hypothetical section of the logic section. This is a Fairchild Micrologic 914, one of the actual chips used in the CK37. Now, the original computer used metal cap chips like these. Unfortunately, I could only get hold of 4 of these, so we'll have to make do with one of these resin-capped ones too. The chip inside is still identical. As I mentioned, prior to about 1962, if we wanted to make a computer, everything had to be built from individual transistors and resistors. A good first step is to build a universal logic gate. Here is how we build a NOR gate from transistors and resistors. In principle, if you can build a NOR gate, and you can build some form of memory, and we'll get to memory later, you can build a computer. That is because NOR gates can be used to build any other gate. And that's what these ICs are. These are NOR gates. There are 2 on each chip. We provide inputs here, and our outputs are here. Voltage and ground are supplied through these pins. So that's 6 resistors and 4 transistors reduced to a single chip. Great. Though this is a very simple IC, we can already appreciate how ICs like these reduced the size and complexity of early computers. Okay, great, a NOR gate, so let's make it think. If we arrange them like this, we have a full binary adder. It takes 3 inputs and outputs the sum, so this can add up to 3. Let's build it physically with my ICs. If we did this today, we'd build it all on a simple PCB. But PCB standards were not where they are today back in the 1960s. To reduce the risk of individual boards becoming dislodged and disconnected during high-G maneuvers, the components were mounted on aluminum beams and connected via very thin circuit boards at the sides. Our 3 inputs are here, and our outputs are here, with LEDs to indicate the results. You can see me changing the inputs and the output LEDs displaying the result accordingly. For anyone wondering, this was really difficult to design, even if it is a really simple circuit. Modern PCB software doesn't really expect you to split components across 2 boards like this. I'm sure there's a way to do it properly, but this is most certainly not the channel to come to for good circuit design. What I've actually done for those interested is build a half adder on each board, since each IC contains 2 NOR gates. The 2 boards are connected by common ground and voltage, much like in the original design where hand-soldered wires connected boards together. The full adder I've created isn't much use on its own, but let's think of the inputs and outputs a little differently. If we label the inputs as 2 operands and a carry in, and label the outputs as a result and a carry out, we can start chaining full adders together. Here's an example of an 8-bit adder that I built in Conway's Game of Life years ago because I was bored. You can see me feeding the inputs in here, And if we speed up the clock, we can see the carries being passed up the chain until the final result is displayed here. In our hypothetical CK37 circuit unit, maybe we'd chain multiple adders to create a circuit that could add 13-bit numbers. I don't think it's a huge stretch to envisage other integrated circuits forming other logical units which could eventually be built up to form the computer as a whole. Of course, there is a slight catch. The UL914 was the only of the original chips I could get hold of in reasonable numbers for a reasonable price. By the time the second prototype was built, Fairchild had released a half-adder IC. 2 half-adders and an OR gate make a full adder. So what I did here with 5 ICs would have been done with 3 in the CK37. Now, multiple beams like these, or circuit units as they were called, were connected to form a frame. And multiple frames were stacked to form each unit of the CK37 as a whole. And that is how the logic and the I/O would have been built up. But how about the memory? The memory was ferrite core memory. 8,192 28-bit words were available. 2 of those were parity bits, hence me mentioning 13 bits earlier. As with so many old computers, the CK37 used that unconventional word length. Now that memory equates to about 28 kilobytes, which for the time was pretty substantial. Of those 8,192 words, 6,144 were write protected and were preloaded with the flight software and all of the fixed variables. Included in those fixed variables were the coordinates of common waypoints around Sweden and the runway coordinates and directions for all relevant airfields in Sweden. All of these were able to fit into memory. The other 2,048 words were writable, so were used for storing variables that the programs needed to read and write to. In addition, this space could be used to store additional navigational waypoints which could be input and altered by the pilot in flight if necessary. Additional subroutines could also be loaded into this space on the ground using a programmer interface. Like every aircraft, the Viggen was not perfect. Several early flights resulted in crashes. One of the more famous advantages of ferrous core memory over early flash memory is its resistance to crashes, as it's non-volatile. If the boards were recovered, their contents could be read back. And indeed this happened on at least a couple of occasions during the early 1970s. The computer was rugged enough to survive these crashes, with the variables written to memory immediately prior to the crash still readable. It was discovered that sudden onset stalling on one wing had led to the aircraft becoming almost instantly uncontrollable, with the pilots being automatically ejected and therefore unable to explain what happened. In one instance, the final recorded altitude was negative 10 meters. That's because that Viggen crashed into the sea. Apparently the engineers were rather pleased that the computer had clearly continued working briefly whilst being submerged. Later revisions added an additional 8,192 words of solid-state EEPROM and 2,048 words of non-rewritable PROM memory. Amongst other new functions, this allowed the AJ37 cockpit to be upgraded to include a moving map display, which was included as standard on the later JA37. Only 2 kilobytes of memory was required to store a map of the entirety of Sweden, so I presume it went in this EEPROM. Another nice example of the limited mission scope of the Viggen working in its favour. It was only ever intended to operate over Sweden, so it only ever needed to include a map of Sweden. We've already discussed what the CK37 did, so now I'd like to look in detail at how it did what it did. The clock speed was about 357 kHz, and the total memory available was about 28.6 kilobytes. On its own, this doesn't feel like a great deal to work with, especially considering the computer was required to run computations in real time. However, thanks to the dedicated I/O unit, the interfacing capability was quite impressive. There were 35 inputs from and 32 outputs to digital to analog converters, allowing the machine to interpret data from the various sensors built into the aircraft. 12 digital outputs allowed for interfacing with other electronic systems, presumably the weapons system and radar. The flight program was a continuous loop of various subroutines that ran repeatedly on a 103 millisecond interval. This doesn't sound particularly fast, it's about a tenth of a second, but considering the average human reaction time is about a third of a second, it was fast enough to provide outputs to the pilot without a detectable lag. There is an exception to that, but we'll get there in a second. Here is the program loop with all of the subroutines shown. The first few were essentially administrative and ensured necessary variables were retrieved from memory and that the initial values from the program were set up properly. The main logic program reads the selector switches in the cockpit and decides which branch of the main loop to take. If the mode selector switch is not set to a flight mode, most of the main program is skipped and the computer just performs self-checking. If the aircraft is in flight, the following programs are run. Note that each subprogram also contained its own branches and possibly loops, but these were all self-contained, and some would write global variables to memory that could be read by subsequent subprograms. The air data program read in data from the various sensors and made it available in the rewritable memory. This was followed by the velocity filtering routine, which removed noise from this data and computed the aircraft's state vector, presumably passing metrics such as airspeed and angle of attack onto the display instruments. The Doppler radar also contributed to the velocity computation and allowed the ground speed to be inferred by observing the Doppler-shifted radar return from the ground. Radio navigation was performed next, automatically reading from the radio navaids instruments, allowing for a position fix. Dead reckoning navigation was the next subprogram. This integrated the outputs from the inertial guidance unit to compute the aircraft's current position. The inertial guidance was actually operated in a closed loop, so at this point the computer sent corrections to the stable platform, allowing it to be realigned via magnetic coils if necessary. I believe the term for this is re-enunciating, but I'm saying that from memory. The term doesn't seem to translate from Swedish. With the aircraft position determined, an administration subprogram would check for waypoint alterations made by the pilot via the navigation console. The waypoint navigation was then performed, probably the most crucial of all the subprograms, as this was the primary requirement for the CK37 to act as a navigator. It'd compute the heading to the next waypoint. Landing navigation was then performed. Of course, if the selector switch was not in landing mode, the program would immediately brake and move on to time and fuel monitoring, another crucial aspect for waypoint navigation. You'll notice at this point we've calculated a lot, but haven't made much of that information available to the pilot. The radar display program added any necessary markers onto the radar screen at this point. This was followed by the fire control subprogram, which computed lead and ballistic drop for unguided weaponry, and the position in which to plot a target marker. Again, these computations would only be performed if the selector switch was in the appropriate mode. Finally, all the necessary variables were converted to physical locations on the heads-up display and plotted there using the display subprogram. Finally, the program returned to the main branch where some self-checking routines were run and the entire loop repeated. Now, let's go back and talk about that 103 millisecond cycle time. The one output that was unacceptably slow was the heads-up display. Every 34 milliseconds, a counter triggered an interrupt, and that paused all calculations and updated the artificial horizon and the velocity vector on the HUD. This was frequent enough to eliminate perceptible lag to the pilot. Other interrupts were used elsewhere, mainly for fault handling. For example, if a power fluctuation was detected, an interrupt would trigger and save the contents from all of the registers to memory. This would allow the program to resume if power was periodically lost and then regained. Even with the limited compute resources, all of the above was able to be performed in that 103 millisecond loop, with about 10% time to spare. So, the remaining 10% was used to perform diagnostic checks, where known randomized inputs would be fed into the computer to check it returned the correct outputs. Any deviations would be reported as a fault to the pilot. The act of programming the CK37 sounds surprisingly advanced and organised for the time. All the subprograms I mentioned could be run standalone and independent of one another, so this allowed them to be developed by individual programmers and tested separately. Programming was conducted using the NAC assembly language. Code was initially written by hand, documented, checked, and signed off during coordination meetings. Over time, the team started developing and following templates for both code and variables, and draft copies of each subprogram were filed away in binders, complete with documentation. This absolutely sounds like a 1960s version of a modern-day code review. Really rather impressive considering this was before terms like software engineer and version control even existed. To translate from a handwritten code sheet to working code, a team of data entry clerks would punch each instruction onto paper tape using a teletype machine and return the code strip the next day. I quite enjoy reading about SAAB's store of useful programs, as I keep having to remind myself this was a room physically full of punched paper tape rolls. To test each subprogram, a mainframe computer was needed. Now, this was the 1960s, so we'd expect an IBM mainframe to appear at this point. But no, SAAB continued to impress me. They built their own. Taking design principles from the D2, they'd constructed the D21 mainframe shortly afterwards. When hooked up to a paper tape reader, the programs could be read in and run. It was even possible to load in corrections via correction strips if a program failed due to a diagnosable cause. So, SAAB had the capability to produce, test, and correct a program within 48 hours using entirely in-house resources. I believe the modern-day term for that is vertical integration. As the CK37 prototypes came into existence, the software became more and more complex and complete. By the time of the first flight, a dedicated control panel was constructed to load in programs, though all the prototypes still used paper tape. The operational computers switched to magnetic tape. This allowed updates to be delivered to the entire Viggen fleet, quote, literally overnight, end quote, if necessary. I will note this is a significant advantage over both the F-14 Central Air Data Computer and the Apollo Guidance Computer. Neither had an ability to update their entire codebase without either physically removing and replacing a ROM chip or having more core rope memory manufactured. The code for the CK37 was updated and improved until its retirement in 2001. Subroutines reading and writing to global variables and being triggered based on a timer were supplemented with object-oriented code sometime in the 1980s. In addition to the memory upgrades I mentioned earlier, the AJS variant incorporated an Intel 286 coprocessor, and the programming was eventually moved from handwritten sheets and teletype machines to Sun Microsystems workstations. But the base hardware of the CK37 remained, and it continued to run essentially the same program loop created in the 1960s with additions throughout its entire operational life. Like so much cutting-edge military hardware, the Viggen was never really used in anger. And that is, I suppose, the intended outcome of an armed neutrality policy. But that doesn't mean they weren't deployed regularly to ward off probing Soviet, and sometimes NATO, aircraft. They were involved in several non-shooting engagements that have since gone down in the history books. But I'd like to take this chapter to discuss the most famous. And this one specifically involved the AJ-37 variant. The Whiskey on the Rocks incident. At the time, one country was indeed stupid enough to screw around with Sweden's borders, and then continue to consistently make the worst possible decisions at every opportunity. Absolutely no prizes for guessing that country was the Soviet Union. Okay, so I'll just do the 2-minute summary, because there's already a brilliant video on this incident by History of Everything, and another by Scruffy Tales. On the evening of the 27th of October 1981, fishermen operating just outside of Karlskrona heard the unusually loud sound of diesel engines coming from the rocks just off the coast. The next morning, locals awoke to discover a Soviet submarine just, well, sitting there on the surface. It had run aground on a rock and was stuck there. Now, Karlskrona just happens to be the home of the largest naval base in Sweden, and the Swedish Navy were undergoing a bunch of exercises at the time. So, I don't think we need to kid around here. The Soviets were spying. The report I included in my sources, and take most of this info from, lists 5 possible reasons the Soviets put the submarine where it was. 4 of them are variations on spying, and the 5th is, quote, the final examination of the young submarine commander, unquote, which is equally ridiculous. Of course, things were about to get a lot more ridiculous. When confronted by Swedish patrol boats, the Soviet captain claimed the submarine was lost due to all of their navigation equipment simultaneously failing. Now, we've spoke about submarine navigation in the past on this channel. I know this was a Soviet Union and it was running a 30-year-old tin can, but multiple gyro compasses, inertial systems, astronavigation, radio beacons, everything else failing all at once? My 6-year-old son could tell a better lie than that. The submarine captain repeated the lie under interrogation. When Soviet diplomats were summoned to the Swedish embassy, you'd expect them to drop the facade and apologise, let the pencil pushers handle the fallout and get over it together. No, they went with the lie too. Our equipment is useless and our crews are incompetent was somehow better to them than, this is our fault, sorry. Around this point, Soviet High Command decided that the correct course of action would not be to apologise, but to send over a flotilla of warships. These included a couple of missile destroyers and corvettes, along with salvage vessels and submarines. This sat just off the 12 nautical mile international waterline. And to be crystal clear, had they crossed that line, that would be an act of war, and the Swedes would have acted accordingly. The Swedish Prime Minister gave the famous order to hold the border. From this point onwards, AJ-37 Viggens were constantly in the air, monitoring and harassing the Soviet fleet and carrying out repeated flyovers of the submarine. This was, of course, a very explicit show of force. Had things got hot, the AJ-37s would first escalate to a more direct show of force by dropping a bomb in front of any vessels crossing the border. That didn't stop them strafing runs that had been carried out using air-to-surface rockets. Finally, anti-ship missiles would have been used to sink the fleet. And make no mistake, the Swedes had the best anti-ship missile on Earth at the time. There is a good chance that fleet would have ended up on the bottom of the Baltic.
Whoa, alright, listening back, I inadvertently said something controversial there. I'm British, so obviously my true position is the best anti-ship missile around in the 1980s was the Exocet. Regardless, the Swedish RB-04 anti-ship missiles of the time were apparently excellent.
Luckily, it never got that far, and I can only imagine how the Soviets would have reacted to that. But there was one more aspect to this incident that elevated it from typical Soviet decision process to stupid Cuban missile crisis. The Swedes quietly included a fiberglass-hulled monitoring boat with the patrol boats that sat alongside the submarine. As they passed by the torpedo tubes, they detected the signature of uranium-238. The submarine was armed with nuclear torpedoes. Of all the poor decisions the Soviets made during this event, this has to be the worst. I cannot even begin to imagine the decision process that led to them putting nuclear armaments on a spy submarine. But I guess this was the Soviet Union in the 1980s. There probably was no decision process. I like to imagine someone put them there years ago and just kind of forgot about them. Anyway, this was something of a big deal given the current situation. Not only was the submarine now a potential nuclear mine, but the Swedes had always been a non-nuclear nation. Not that that makes things much worse, but covertly bringing nuclear armaments across the border into a neutral, non-nuclear country isn't exactly what we do to make friends. Following a discussion between the Soviet ambassador and the Swedish foreign ministry that I can only begin to imagine, the ambassador all but confirmed the submarine was carrying nuclear torpedoes. Sweden lodged the angriest sounding diplomatic note I have ever read with Moscow, and we can all make the joke about them sending an angry letter, but a few days later, on November the 6th, diplomacy prevailed. Now, reading this back, I've just remembered that Hans Blix is Swedish, which makes that even funnier. In fact, after I went and read up a little bit more, I realised he was the Minister for Foreign Affairs just a couple of years prior to this incident. He very nearly was literally the person who wrote the angry letter. Anyway, the mess was concluded when Swedish salvage vessels towed the sub off the rocks and handed it over at the borderline. And that is possibly the closest Europe ever came to nuclear war. The closest the Swedes came to mobilising their entire population, and the most famous operation the AJ-37 was ever used in. Now, I'd like to finish by reflecting just for a second on the world today. The Whiskey on the Rocks incident could have been a minor spat and would have been quickly resolved and largely forgotten were Soviet leadership willing to apologise and admit they'd made a mistake. In recent years, at least a couple of Western nations, including the UK where I live, have willingly elected leaders who have demonstrated, or just flat out stated, they do not back down and never apologise, as it is, paraphrase quote, a sign of weakness. Make of that what you will. I think the CK37 was an elegant solution to a very particular problem. It's something I hadn't really studied much before I made the video on digital fly-by-wire about a year ago, but it's definitely something the Swedes were proud of, and rightfully continue to be proud of to this day, evidenced by the number of requests I've had to make this video. Today, it is absolutely reasonable that many new technology breakthroughs are met with skepticism from the general public. Who listening to this video actually uses what is now referred to as AI for anything genuinely useful? And filtering out oversold hype from genuine innovation can be really difficult. Amongst other things, I always look for tangible applications and a proven track record when evaluating emerging technology. Back in 1960, the CK37 had an extremely well-defined objective, and meeting that objective would remove both a crew member and an engine from Sweden's frontline fighter jet. In retrospect, investing in development of an IC-based computer was a no-brainer. When presented with the 200-kilogram Forerunner in 1960, leaders did not have this hindsight, so pursuing the CK37 would have seemed far riskier. However, the actual engineers at SAAB were reportedly delighted with that 200-kilogram machine. It represented a proven track record. This was iterated on over the next decade to produce a revolutionary final product. And that is what real innovation usually looks like. To move fast, we move in gradual and measured steps. And in the case of the Viggen, the end result was most certainly one thing: fast. Thank you very much for watching.